we notice in the first reading, which is fairly early in the canon of Scripture with regard to the New Testament itself, Paul writing to the Galatians, that we have indications of its primitive nature from the words used and the context referred to. Did you notice that he is still using what the early band was using amongst themselves? The word that the Lord used was kephas, stone, rock, which when they cracked the mold and went more towards the Greek than towards the Hebrew, became Petros and remained so, Peter. But here we're in the early stage, and we also find the important threesome coming through. Along with Kephas, we have these pillars, James and John. And we notice also that there is a reference to the band that with James was hanging on to what James was representing. Jerusalem, the strong Jewish line. And therefore this is the crux of the matter when it comes to the argument. Now, this is after the Council of Jerusalem, the first council in the church, when it had already actually been thrashed out, the relationship of the new converts to Judaism, what was expected of them. But here we have an unwillingness to go out of the comfort zone, not in itself because of that, but because of the problem of facing those who are keen still on maintaining these things. So Peter was in a difficult situation, and he was handled quite, not roughly, but with plain words by Paul, which is interesting because in revealing this fact, he's revealing the inner dynamics of the early central core. They could have these plain words amongst each other. We find it coming out also in the Acts of the Apostles when it comes to a certain split happening with regard to who was to go with Paul on one missionary journey. And by reporting these things, by the way, the writer of the Acts is actually indicating how true is his historical account, because if they were doing apologetics, they wouldn't do that. When they reveal all the bits, painted warts and all, it's a proof actually of historical authenticity. They're not hiding anything. So here, by not hiding this internal tension, they're in a way showing how this is going to be the pattern over the centuries. And in this, our own period, it's important to remember that. Why? What is going on right here in this passage? Well, it's a bishop giving fraternal correction to another bishop. Only in this case, it is the one that already they are recognizing as the head of the College of Apostles, the Supreme Pontiff, and he is already taking form embryonically as that in their mind. Why? We can see already in every reference to the Apostles throughout the New Testament, always he's named first, and say what you like, they are aware of that primacy. And already in the Gospel itself, we can see it coming through, for instance, in the fear that the other two great pillars in the centre, James and John, have of precisely not having the fullness of the career that their mother wants them to have. She wants them to be right next to the Lord, one at the right and the other at the left, therefore excluding Peter. So it's right there in the beginning, and therefore we see it's part of the structure of the church itself, Peter. But, and this is an important but, we must be careful when we misunderstand the protection that's given to Peter. It was clearly defined in the First Vatican Council, which unfortunately was interrupted and had to close very abruptly because of the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. But it's there, and it's very, very strict. And it has to be understood as such. There is an old saying actually in moral theology, odiosa maxime sunt restringenda. Odious things, painful things, are to be to the maximum restricted, that is to say, interpreted in the strict sense. This therefore applies in a supreme way to the definition of papal infallibility. Because what tends to happen in the popular mind is the notion of creeping infallibility. That one thinks that everything that a pope says is in some way also protected by that gift. It's not quite so simple, and to make it so is actually to damage our understanding of the faith and not to help it. Just to be clear, it's only when solemnly making a declaration on faith or morals to the entire universal church and intending it to be taken as such, that there is genuinely that divine protection, which has to be there because of the promise of the Lord. Just to be aware. And by the way, it's thought that it was being invoked clearly enough for it to be definitive when St. John Paul II, in Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, did define in the end that it was only a male that was capax, capable as a vessel to receive holy orders. That's meant for the whole church, and he was meaning it to be taken as not reformable. I close that parenthesis, but just to help you to see and navigate right now in the rather confusing atmosphere in which we're involved. I make a jump. The Gospel is short but essential. It has a parallel in Matthew. The language of Matthew is very Semitic. It's synagogal, and we have the complete liturgical form of the Our Father coming through there, with the parallels complete. It's only one parallel really that we have in Luke. It's the one about as we forgive. That's maintained. Interesting, because that shows how it was there from the beginning as an essential ingredient of the Our Father, and a perpetual reminder until the end of time that we can't ask for forgiveness and not grant it. With regard to the context, we see that the disciples find him at prayer and ask him to teach them to pray, and it became the title of a very good book by a great abbot in France, Abbé André Louf. He was at Mondécat in the north of France. Seigneur, apprends-nous à prier. Lord, teach us to pray. And he wrote a whole volume expounding really what essentially contemplative prayer was about, and how the structure of monastic life supremely protected it. I want to look into one area. It's the protection. If God is a father, then he cares for us. He cares for us firstly spiritually, hence he's giving us through the Our Father the ingredients also for not damaging our souls. Trust in his providence, honouring him and therefore having the optic correctly adjusted, avoiding the cancer of bitterness in our soul through unforgiveness, making sure that we die with nothing on our copybook which hasn't been sorted, e.g. physical debts, because it talks about debts, that's the actual word, ophelimata. These can be a problem if one dies when, with culpability, one has not paid one's debts with regard to staying in purgatory. It can also be for a priest something which can cause hiccups. And it's known that more than once deceased priests have appeared to to living priests to indicate where the book was with the unsaid obligations of masses that he'd not finished, because he stuck there until they're celebrated. That's happened more than once. But this one of the global care also of the person in his physique and in his existence on earth, providence, is part and parcel. And if we don't believe it, then we are in some way actually participating in the sin of pride. We are, as it were, God. I am responsible and I am in control, and my control mechanism is made of worry, anxiety. I will worry so that nothing can go wrong. It's a mistaken mode, and it's a mistaken notion of ourselves. Why? The creature is on the receiving end, not the commanding end, and to do that all the time gives huge freedom. We espouse the expression of the will of God, which is the present moment, as it comes. We relax in its form, and rather in amoeboid form we espouse it and go around it. We don't command it and stonewall it, creating anxiety, tension and frustration. It's a secret, but it gives huge liberty and freedom. And to help us, he also has given us an invisible, perpetual help. There's obviously the Queen of Angels, but also we have our own. And I want to zoom into that just for a moment, because just now, in this period, when we think a little bit about the angels at the beginning of October, it's something to be borne in mind. We don't invoke them enough. The more we do, the more they're pleased, and the more they can do for us. And it's not incompatible with a certain intellectual life. Great saints and scholars have been very aware of these invisible friends. Some have actually had mystical communion with them. You can think of Frances of Rome, that lady who is the patron saint of Benedictine Oblates. She had a continual rapport with her guardian angel. She would see him, apparently, as well. Beings of light. Well, this happened to a priest. It was a priest, as it happens, who had a real rapport with his guardian angel. And they were kind of buddies. It's almost homely in the way that this would go on. Obviously, the angel was so pleased with the devotion that the priest had that he would encourage him and make himself known to him. He was actually a Jesuit, therefore extremely well educated as well. This is an American testimony, and I read it as I find it. A Crichton University Jesuit named Father Francis, now it's spelled Degelman, it probably is pronounced Daleman, used to fascinate me and other students with his recital of encounters with his personal angel. He carried on a spirited discourse with this being, argued even, and complained. His most dramatic episode occurred early one morning when he was awakened from sleep. "Francis, get up!" Father Daleman glanced at his alarm clock. "It's 3 a.m, he managed to object. But he arose. The guardian angel instructed him to turn on the light. Reluctantly, he fumbled for the wall switch. "Now, turn it off and get back to bed." Daleman shook his head, plunged the room into darkness again, and crept beneath the solo blanket, still wondering what this was all about. The next morning, a student came to see him. "Father, last night I was thinking of taking my life. I tried to get into the campus church, but it was locked. It had to be about 3 o'clock. I sat on the wall outside the Jesuit residence, certain that God didn't care if I lived or died. Then I said, if there is a God, let a light go on in that building. I looked up, and your light was on. The testimony goes on. During World War II, I had a number of close calls when people around me died and somehow I survived. I thought my number hadn't come up. Once I nearly drowned, but wound up on shore, exhausted, not knowing how I got there. Luck, I figured. Lying in bed after a serious operation, I sensed a presence, but hesitated to give it a name. But the clearest example of divine interference happened one moonlit night when I was driving in Wycoming, I'm not sure, or Wyoming, it's a name was said in the area. A Jesuit brother sat beside me, and my wife and a Franciscan nun occupied the rear seats. Since I could see forever on this straight apron of concrete, I was doing a comfortable 60. Now there, it's not kilometres but miles an hour, isn't it, in the States? Mm. Suddenly, a herd of wild horses lunged up from the draw on my right. I was in them before I knew it. I can play that scene in my head any time I wish. The Mustang reared up to starboard and I swung to port just beneath those hooves. Another horse was static there, so I veered right. Still another, and I returned left. With seconds, I was clear of that stampede. My foot still on the brake and the car still registering over 40 miles per hour. "Nice driving, Bob," gasped the scared young Jesuit. But it all seemed easy to me, as if it happened in slow motion, and I had ample time. Listen, I'm a decent driver, but I couldn't have pulled that off. I just conclude with one quotation from St. Thomas Aquinas, an expert on angels. This doctor of the church gives us to understand that the angels actually place part of their felicity, their own felicity, in reigning, each with the Blessed One who was confided to his care, in sitting on the same throne, in wearing, so to say, the same crown, and in forming with him but one heart and one soul, since every man is to have in heaven an angel to reign with him, or in hell